Yeah, that's a good question. I really don't know the answer to that one. Thinking of other places, we actually did some support for NASA when the rovers Spirit and Opportunity were on Mars and were doing, quite a lot of good work a few years ago. And there was a realization, of course, by NASA that there were certain commanding sequences, for example, that they didn't want to initiate and have those be interrupted halfway through if the sun erupted and caused a radio communications problem, for example. So we concerned ourselves for a period of time with actually making predictions of space weather for Mars. And Mars is it's quite different from Earth, but in the main way that it doesn't have a magnetic field like our planet does. It has bits and pieces of magnetic field, so the impacts of that space weather were different at Mars than they are at Earth, which may be the sense of your question. I would guess that for other objects in the heliosphere, some of the impacts would be different, but I really couldn't tell you if they would be for the better or for the worse.
Along similar lines, would technological activities of something like the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP, and other weather modification programs here on Earth affect the consequences that we might feel of these space storms? Do the two talk to each other at all, or is the terrestrial and non-terrestrial completely separate?
Well, I think you've touched on really what one of the real challenges is in this business. We've talked about the sun part and the physics part to this point, where what the sun is doing and the kinds of eruptions and so on. But I think to be meaningful, you also have to bring the technologies that have grown up over the last, 50 years, say, 50 years is a good number, that we've developed on Earth to be, so sophisticated in many ways, the way the power grid is set up, the way that we have a dependency on satellite navigation systems like GPS now, the kinds of satellite communications that we rely on so very heavily, a lot of the pieces of our critical infrastructure. There have been big changes and improvements and alterations. You mentioned the HAARP activity in Alaska and things of that nature. Even the way the commercial airlines fly from continent to continent now, and some of the sensitivities with those flights. The trick is to try to find that tipping point of how much and what type of space weather might be problematic, and if you can identify that, then you try to scale that and make adjustments and we don't really make recommendations because we do the science of it, but the users then try to take that input and then decide, is this something where it would cause them to go to a plan B, or is it business as usual?
I told you before I was a bit of a science fiction aficionado. In 2005, Arthur C. Clarke and Stephen Baxter published the book Sunstorm. By any chance, have you read this book?
I have not.
Okay. In the book, a massive CME was spewed out by the sun, headed straight for Earth. It's going to destroy all life on our planet when it hits. That's the basic plot. What do you do about it? My question for you, is that science fiction, or is that science real possibility of happening?
I would say that is science fiction. It is the case, and even around Halloween of 2003, there's a very well documented, a few week-long episode of a number of CMEs that were very fast and very energetic and had a direct impact on Earth. They were right from the right part of the sun. And so what's the downside? The downside is there are effects on technologies. Are these CMEs of the type that could be more of a draconian effect, such as what? I don't know, eliminate life on Earth in some fashion? I see that in no way being possible.
Okay, and again, I honestly don't know, and there is science fiction, but there is science fact, and sometimes it's quite strange what can actually occur. Where does NOAA fit in? Where does the administration fit into these types of activities? As a mandate, are you just a research development analysis agency, or do you participate in preparedness planning when it comes to space storms and other serious weather events?
Well, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and within NOAA, forgive me for the family tree here, but is the National Weather Service. And the Space Weather Prediction Center, my center, is a component of the National Weather Service. So it's our job, akin to the Weather Service, literally to predict the environment and try to characterize it. However, we do work very closely with other federal agencies, with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, and other litany of federal agencies who have been tasked to prepare for space weather events in a similar way that they prepare for other types of disasters and emergency management. So there's a very good communication and familiarity among the federal agencies to try to understand what the sun can do and how best to prepare for that.
Which raises the question, is there anything ordinary people really can do to prepare for the effects of space or solar storms, or need to do?
Well, I think that the primary, because we're often asked, well, you guys, come on, this is very esoteric stuff. As you mentioned, you talked about some science fiction. Up to 150 years ago, up until our technologies were developed such as they are, my sense is that nobody knew about space weather. You didn't have anything that was affected by space weather. Whereas now, there are many impacts to space weather, but those impacts, almost in every case, are impacts to technologies. They aren't impacts to people, with one wonderful exception, and that exception is the northern lights, or the southern lights are more visible and brighter, and if you've ever seen them, you can count, a good night outside, because they're just a wonderful display to be able to see. But one of the primary impacts of space weather, as we can tell these days, is the effect on the electrical power system. So my advice to people would be, if you have any reason to fear that the electric power where you live may be affected by space weather, plan B, I suppose, would be to go out and buy yourself a generator or make some, alternate plans, because we are so dependent on electricity being freely available. But short of that, I really can't give any good advice as one-on-one sort of preparatory thing. I think the fact that many of the technologies that are affected are of critical infrastructure type, and there are plenty of people both in this country and overseas who are involved in trying to understand the space weather piece and be really prepared for that.
Global warming or ice age? Toward which do you believe we are heading?
Well, that's not in my bailiwick. I have no considered opinion on that subject, just because I worry about the part of the Earth that's above the neutral atmosphere, which is where the global warming or ice age debate would fall.
But isn't the effect of the solar cycles on the Earth exactly the whole point of we're going into an ice age or we're going into a global warming period? I mean, isn't it directly related to the sun?
Well, I want to repeat it. It's not my area of expertise. Let me tell you what I know about the sun. And we know from satellite data over the past 30 years that actually the sun brightens and dims a little bit. The luminosity, the irradiance of the sun changes over the 11-year solar cycle. It doesn't change by much, only changes by about 0.1%, but it is established that the sun is a variable star. So then that raises the question to the climate modelers, okay, how does this play into what you're seeing in terms of the climate record and what you expect to see in the near term or even longer than that in terms of the behavior of the climate? And so there is a well-established piece that pertains to the sun, to the solar cycle, but again, it's then handed off to the climate modelers to decide, is that a big deal, or is that just in the noise?
So it's not as simple as when the sun is in a minimal cycle, we go into an ice age, and when the sun is in a high cycle, we go into warming. It's not as basic as that, then.
That's right. It's not as basic as that.
How do people learn more about solar cycles, space storms, and how to even anticipate what may happen as a result of them? How do people get an education on these issues?
Well, I'll start with what we offer online. The Space Weather Prediction Center, SWPC, .noaa.gov, has quite a lot of information on our website. It includes on the front page the daily forecasts and the current situation, and then there's quite a bit of material that pertains to educational aspects from the physics point of view, the science side, as well as the customer point of view and the affected technologies. So that's, I give ourselves, I shouldn't brag about it, but I give us pretty high marks in trying to help people understand what it is we're doing. And then NASA has a number of very good sites as well, more on the science side, that explain the kinds of missions that they're flying and what they're trying to do in terms of understanding how the sun works.
Most of the time, if you want to go out and you want to take a look at planets, you go to an observatory or something, and you can look through the big telescope and you can see what's going on. How do you observe the sun? Are there special places like, solar observatories where people could actually go and look at the sun?
Well, you're right. It's more the case that there were many of those, Brent. Over the years, it's turned out that if we had this conversation 30 years ago, I would say, sure, come to Boulder where our organization is established, and we have a telescope on the roof with a special filter, and we would make times for people to come and look through the eyepiece, and they could see the fascinating disk of the sun and the movement that you can observe in real time. But, of course, the downside of that was the weather, and on a cloudy day you couldn't see anything. So with satellite data becoming more commonplace and available through the NOAA satellites, the geosynchronous satellites that do all the weather that you see so commonly on TV, they also have space weather instruments that look in the other direction. And then NASA has made a number of missions over the years. There's one called SOHO, which is about 14 or 15 years old now, that looks at the sun from about 1 million miles out. And there's a mission called the Solar Dynamics Observatory. That's another recent NASA mission. And there are more satellites than that. But I guess the short answer is that anymore, it's a satellite data set that we look at just because it offers the advantage of being totally unimpeded by the Earth's weather.
My guest has been Joe Kunches of the Space Weather Prediction Center of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. If you'd like more information, go to www.swpc.noaa.gov. That's swpc.noaa.gov. Joe, thanks so much for spending this time with us and teaching us about space storms.
Thank you, Brent, for having me on.